episode 16 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Today we have a very special guest, and I'm going to try not to butcher the pronunciation here. We have Androulakis-Korakakis with us today, otherwise known as Pac. So I think we'll probably roll with that for the rest of the episode here today. Pac recently has done some really cool work on the concept of minimum effective dose for resistance training, looking at basically how little work can we get away with and still see meaningful increases in 1RM strength. But I'm definitely not the one to talk about this. Pac has put a ton of thought and work into this topic. So before we get to some of your recent work, Pac, could you just kind of give a brief introduction of yourself, kind of how you got into lifting and the research realm, and then we'll kind of dive into some of your recent work. And also, huge thank you for taking the time to join us today, man.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity, and really glad to be involved with you guys and all the work that you do. Just for reference's sake, I have two screens, so I'm looking at the second screen where I have you guys and the camera is there, just so it doesn't look like I'm completely rude here. My name is Pac. That's an abbreviation for my full name, Patroklos Androulakis-Korakakis. I'm originally from Greece, but I live in the UK, and more specifically in Southampton, in England. That's where the Titanic left from. Actually, that's the only fun fact I have about Southampton. Now, I started lifting at around the age of 16. Slowly fell in love with the iron game. Then started experimenting with powerlifting around 5 years in. My lifting career started as most of us did, not bodybuilding, but trying to get bigger and leaner, etc. I then pursued a Bachelor's of Science at Solon University, which was in fitness and personal training, which is essentially sports science with a practical component added to it. So we had things like working with older adults and coaching athletes, etc. As I was doing my bachelor's, I met Dr. James Steele, who got me hooked with research and sort of sparked my interest to actually investigate topics that I was curious about. So as a lifter, I had many questions that as I started digging more and more, and I always liked searching for stuff, I saw that there's a lot of stuff that hasn't been not officially answered, but kind of officially investigated. And that's where I thought, hey, I could be answering some of those questions for my fellow lifters. And then at some point, I decided, after doing a bit of research and publishing some stuff on powerlifters and other strength sport athletes, to pursue a PhD under Dr. James Steele. As you guys mentioned, it was around the minimum effective training dose, i.e. what's the least a powerlifter can do and still lift. And the idea came from a pilot study that we did with a powerlifting coach and a powerlifting team over in Greece, where we basically wanted to look at how low can we push training volume and still see meaningful strength increases. And we had access to a powerlifting team, and he was the coach. So it was a perfect scenario for research, at least for powerlifters, which are a very difficult population to recruit. And then the idea sort of was born from that project. So I thought, hey, initially my PhD was on factors that affect powerlifting performance. It was a very generic topic. And then we thought, hey, how do we actually look into what's the least one can do and still get meaningfully stronger? Because there wasn't much on that. I mean, there isn't much on powerlifting in general. And at the moment where we stand is I've submitted my PhD. I'm waiting now to defend it. And we've published a systematic review going over the current literature and and trying to answer the question of what's the least somebody can do and still get stronger, as well as a multi-experiment paper that is comprised of 5 studies that are all part of the PhD, all on powerlifters. We can dig into the details as we go on. But essentially that's out there now as a preprint, hasn't been officially peer reviewed, aside from the 8 peers that reviewed it, because there were other co-authors on that paper. And yes, looking forward to having it officially published just so it gets a bit more traction. And that's that. That's me.
Awesome, man. I think probably a good place to start before we go down different rabbit holes is just to kind of if you don't mind giving like a brief overview of the sequence of studies in that preprint and the
Mm-hmm.
general findings. I mean, this we'll link the preprint in the description of this episode, no matter
Certainly
where you're
sounds.
listening to this. I mean, it's just an awesome manuscript with just very well outlined, and I think it was really interesting how you guys kind of did this sequence of studies, which again we'll probably get into. But Pac, if you don't mind, just briefly
Sure.
going over kind of the sequence of studies you guys did and the general outcomes you found, and then we can use that as a jumping off point
Mm-hmm.
to get into some rabbit holes.
So for some of the people that are listening to this that may not be aware of what a multi-experiment paper is, that's something that we don't often see in sports science. And the studies that we look at as lifters, but it's a very common thing in, for example, psychology. So if you go on some psychology journals, you'll see that there are studies that have a research question and then experiment 1, experiment 2, experiment 3, all bundled up in a single paper. So what happened was I had to do a few studies for my PhD, and wanted to publish those. Originally, the idea was to publish them separately, but because they're all under the same topic, the minimum effective dose for 1 RM strength, I thought that it would really dilute the message, the totality of evidence if we had 5 or 6 different studies out there, all on the same topic, some with small samples and all on powerlifters, because already people are confusing the systematic review of the project with a multi-experiment paper, simply because they're on the same topic and a similar population. Anyways, so 5 studies. Study 1 was an interview study with powerlifters and powerlifting coaches, and we were fortunate enough to get some help with the recruitment process, and we were able to recruit some elite powerlifters to participate, and some very experienced coaches, where we asked them questions around the minimum effective dose, its utility, its limitations, and trying to essentially quantify it. But obviously, we were trying to get sort of richer data through those interviews. Then the second training study was okay. A bit of a bit of background. There was we were planning on doing a few training studies, and in order to appropriately analyze the data, we didn't want to just use inferential statistics, because we were aware that the samples that we were going to recruit were not going to be anything that would allow us to be very confident those statistics. So we essentially powerlifting athletes and coaches through interviews and a survey. We use the same sample from study 1 to interview. So we use the elite powerlifters and the experienced coaches to ask them what they regard as a meaningful strength change over the time that we used the training intervention studies. Makes sense? So the training intervention studies were 6 weeks. So we said, hey, what do you think is a meaningful strength increase in squat, bench press, deadlift, and total strength in 6 weeks? As well as some other questions around the topic, what could affect meaningfulness, et cetera, et cetera. And then we also had a survey that was distributed to a much larger sample of coaches and athletes of all levels, where we asked them to simply quantify what would you regard as a meaningful strength change. And those were used to for us to be able to better analyze our data for the training studies. So then we have studies 3 and 4, where the training studies essentially compared minimum effective dose protocols against each other. And we wanted to see overall what their effect was on 1RM strength. Study 1 was basically one group doing singles at RP 9 to 9.5, 3 times a week, on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, with a 2-3-1 squat, bench press, and deadlift frequency. So squat, bench on Monday, deadlift, bench on Wednesday, squat, bench on Friday. All they did was one single for each of those lifts, RP 9.5, 9 to 9.5, and they were also obviously performing their warm-ups until they reached that single. And they were compared, they went against a group that did the same exact thing, plus 2 back-off sets of 3 repetitions at 80% of the single. So they did their top single of the day, took 80% of that and did 2 triples. And then study 4 was the singles and back off group again versus a group doing just one AMRAP set at 70% 1RM with the same exact training frequency. So those were the training studies. And last but not least, there was also a study that we distributed to competitive powerlifters. So they had to provide some sort of evidence for competing at a national level competition. We had some sort of a criteria to ensure that they were of a certain level, and we asked them if they had experimented with minimum effective training dose. If not, why not, and would they be willing to, as well as a few other questions. And for those that said yes, more details on how many sets they did, how many accessories they did, reps, RPE, how they felt, what strength changes they saw, etc., etc., etc. So that, I know it's a lot of information together, but that was essentially that paper, that multi-experiment paper. And in terms of findings, if I am to express findings in the most brief way possible, a few heavy sets of 1 to 5 repetitions, 2 to 3 times per week. So 1 to 3 times per power lift, at an RPE above 8 are sufficient to make meaningful strength increases, at least for a period of 6 to 12 weeks. So that's a very simple, brief summary of the findings. Some slight terms and conditions, obviously, for the training interventions. The sample sizes were not anything extreme, so we need to be cautious when interpreting. Yeah, but the interview and survey data together kind of come to sort of address that gap and give a bit more confidence in the overall summary of findings. Pow, as Pop Smoke would say, RIP.
Awesome, dude. I guess I just want to zone in on the surveys just a little bit to start here. Were you surprised? Like, to me, when I hear, like, especially for advanced lifters in 6 weeks, immediately my head goes to any progress is progress. Were you surprised to see a little bit more of the varied results in terms of what people expected to call meaningful changes in that kind of time frame?
Yeah, and it was really, really interesting to see the difference between the survey, because the survey went out to 137 people, all levels. There was no, you didn't have to be a national level coach or a national level athlete. And then the interview part was only with the elite powerlifters, some of them all-time world record holders and IPF world champions, and the coaches. And the elite powerlifters, a lot of them said, or a few of them said, anything would be progress. Similarly to some of the coaches, any progress is meaningful progress. And then there were some lifters in the survey responses where they had some extreme total increases, like 30, 40, 50 kilos in 6 weeks. There was a guy that entered 580 kilos, but that was excluded, as I assumed that was a mistake. But yeah, it was very interesting to see that difference. And I think the main sort of determinant for that difference was the level of the athletes and the coaches. So the more inexperienced athletes were, and now this is not terms and conditions apply, this is just from my own observation, they were more likely to say, oh, 30, 40, 50 kilos in 6 weeks compared to the more experienced lifters or coaches, where some coaches even said, hey, even a lower RPE at the same weight is top progress.
Yeah, I think just reading through the paper, it was really I think refreshing to see kind of how everything was worded and how everything was presented. Don't quote me on this, but I think with like studies 3 and studies 4, the 2 6-week training studies, I think you guys even used the verbiage of like, this is an exploratory analysis, and I think that's a really cool way to frame it. But anyway, kind of continuing on the point of study 2, which again was when you guys kind of interviewed these athletes and coaches to see, hey, what is a meaningful gain in strength in 6 weeks? Because as you described, that can kind of inform the analysis for studies 3 and 4, the actual training studies. And of course, correct me if I'm misquoting kind of the findings here, but that the total increase of somewhere around like 16 to 17 kilos in about 6 weeks. Again, like you said, terms and conditions applied. I'm sure it varies based on level of experience of the athlete and the coach and whatnot. I guess my question for you is, what do you think the pros and cons are of this approach? Obviously, there are multiple pros of this. You guys wouldn't have taken that approach otherwise. And I think it's a really cool way to do it. It's, to my understanding, that's the first time it's kind of been done in the sports science research. But do you see any drawbacks to that approach? Now that you've written up this paper and you've kind of probably been able to reflect on it, do you think there's any downsides to that approach? Like we kind of mentioned, if somebody thinks putting 580 kilos on their total in 6 weeks is meaningful progress, maybe there's a difference. Maybe there's a mismatch between like what people expect and people kind of overestimate what they think they can gain in a certain time period. So anyway, I'm just curious your thoughts if there's any like particular cons to that approach that you've come across.
For sure. And again, it's something that I'm glad you guys are communicating as well, being cautious and obviously understanding that this was a cool project and we try to make it as complete as possible, but at the same time, it's one project and there's obviously limitations to it. One limitation would be that, but we semi-address that limitation. As Dr. James Steele, if you see, it's mostly linked in the supplementary material. What he did is he looked at openpowerlifting.org and filtered lifters to match the criteria of the studies in terms of being raw, et cetera, et cetera. And he compared the responses of the coaches and the athletes to what is required, what strength changes is required to move from one place to the higher place in a competition. And those they were very similar. So there was a bit of a sanity check, like, because obviously, again, that's a perfect point, and I would say exactly the same. If we happen to ask the 137 weird athletes and coaches who thought, hey, meaningful increase is 3 kilos in 6 weeks, or vice versa, 50 kilos, then how can we actually verify that that's kind of close to what would be an actual pragmatic, meaningful increase and give it some ecological validity? So that analysis by Dr. Steele kind of gives it some credibility, if that makes sense. And the actual graph for it, if you go on the preprint, there's a link for supplementary materials, and you can find that in there, where it kind of has the two lines and how close they are. So what the coaches and athletes predicted and what was necessary for athletes to move up one place in competition. And for total, they were very, very close. So it was the objective measure was 16.1 kilos, and the subjective measure was 17.5. That's for total increase.
Interesting. Yes. I don't want to take us too far on a tangent here, but I'm just thinking, if we zone in on the two training studies a little bit now, like you said, standard terms and conditions apply. Only a few studies, so we've got to make sure that's out there. But one thing that immediately kind of came to my mind was, I don't know your kind of views on the relationship between strength and size. Is it contributory? Is it not? That kind of thing. I can't remember the exact number, but you talked about in the text how much of a volume increase adding those backoffs was. And it's even just a little bit, and it's a huge increase versus the 1RM. And then additionally, the 1RM backoffs, 1RM plus backoffs versus the AMRAP group. Do you think that these groups potentially could have been getting stronger for different reasons? I'm particularly thinking of the 1RM plus backoffs versus the AMRAP as opposed to the other one, but I guess the other one works too, just because the groups doing a little bit more training volume probably had a chance to grow in that 6 weeks, as opposed to like being totally kind of a skill driven thing. Do you think, like, what's your general thoughts on that relationship? And do you think there's any kind of interesting things we can kind of draw from your study to kind of see some interesting ideas on that.
So I'm not entirely sure whether there was, they were growing in such a short amount of time and coming off, most of them coming off from larger, larger volume, larger training volumes. As we had kind of said, look, one of the inclusion criteria was to not have experimented with daily max training shortly before the training studies. But I think that that's one of the limitations and something that would have been cool if we had controlled. Because I think, knowing some of the lifters personally, some of them were not at their peak form strength-wise. Obviously, they weren't untrained; they were still training. So that sudden switch from, okay, I'm doing volume work at whatever percentage, but I'm nowhere near my peak in strength, to all of a sudden now I'm doing heavy singles and some extra volume. I expected to sort of see that peak in that group. But I think it was mostly the additional volume that helped the Backovs group in terms of extra practice and that extra stimulus. I'm not sure if there was enough stimulus for hypertrophy, especially in such a short period of time. And I think that kind of showed us how sensitive or how potentially sensitive volume can be when you go to those extremes. So even the added 2 sets of 3, which time wise, commitment wise, is nothing, and effort wise, they were all pretty. They weren't close to the 9.5 RPEs of the main sets, and still they managed to make much better gains. Something that we also saw with the AMRAP group, where the AMRAP group was not doing something super specific, but as you guys pointed out the other day, that practice with those reps was made a much bigger difference than the super specific, just a single at RP 9 to 9.5. But yeah, I think we kind of saw that the minimum dose for maintenance might be super low, even lower than we think, because obviously we need more studies to look at those sort of daily max protocols and potentially experiment with a protocol that would have a once a week frequency for the squat and the bench, which was the original plan, but there was no chance we were going to get buy-in from lifters to participate in that. And we see that just adding a sprinkle of volume can make a huge difference, especially when you're that low.
Yeah, I think it's super interesting, and the more that I think about kind of studies 3 and 4, which again were those training studies, I really like the groups and how they were designed, because I think it again, like you said multiple times, there's a ton of caveats here, but I think this gives us a good amount of insight, and I think it allows for some really cool comparison, because I think and we've definitely talked about this as well before, is that peak intensity is probably pretty important for a power lifter. I think that makes some sense. I don't know if there's like a ton of good data directly on that, but I think I think we would probably take that position. But based on this, it seems as if peak intensity in isolation or only peak intensity might be slightly inferior to, like you said, 2 triples at 80% of that top set, which is going to be like 4 to 6 reps in reserves, give or take, for most people. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but like I think that's really interesting there. So that's my first comment. My next, and feel free to disagree with that if you do. And then the second thing is, do you think that there was like an artificial peak for a lot of these lifters? So it was a 6-week training study, and like it sounds like a good amount of them were doing pretty high volumes, or at least higher than what they were prescribed here. Yeah. So like, do you think it was kind of an artificial peak? And then the natural extension of that question is, okay, what if this was a 12-week study? What if this was a 16-week study? Then do we start to see these meaningful increases kind of start to dissipate? I'm curious your thoughts. I know I threw a lot at you, but
No. That's a very interesting question, and I think that was definitely some of the effect that we saw there. That it wasn't that this was a magical formula minimum dose. I think what we saw was a lot of these athletes coming off higher volumes and lower. I'm afraid as a student of Dr. James Steele, I am not legally allowed to use the word intensity, so I will use the word load. Um, Shout out to Dr. James Steele. But yeah, they were coming off higher volumes, at least higher than what they were doing, and lighter loads, at least for the most part. So that super specific stimulus, as well as the very heavy loads and the short period of time. I think it did act as a short peak, um, and we had seen. So we had done a pilot study with the powerlifters in Greece, and they did it for 10 weeks. So they just did singles without the backup sets, and but they were tested at competition. That was at a national level competition. Which, looking back, when we did it, we were like, perfect. This is the ideal study design because it's as realistic as possible. But obviously, as you guys know, testing in comp or testing in the training hall is a very different atmosphere, and things are different in comp for a plethora of reasons. And we saw that two out of those five lifters that were doing the singles for 10 weeks and tested at week 11, they actually either did not gain or lost a bit of strength, and two of them increased. Um, so there is a slight hint there that maybe just doing the singles for such a long time might have some deleterious effects on performance. But from what the powerlifting athletes and coaches said, and that's where the project comes in, that's why I wanted all the studies to be on one paper. Um, a lot of, a few athletes and coaches of great experience said that they gave ranges from 6 to 12 weeks for a minimum dose approach being effective. Uh, my personal opinion is that I think they would have been able to still see meaningful increases for up to 8 weeks if I had to, let's say, bet on it. But I think after a certain point, after the 8 week mark, at least for some lifters, and especially for the ones that were doing just the singles, um, I think things would start to get not only monotonous in terms of the training, because we got to factor that in as well, but I think they would need that extra volume. Obviously, it's something that we want to do in the future. But if I was to experiment, so if there's any practical takeaways here, I would um, kind of say 6 to 8 weeks as a starting point. See how I'm feeling. Obviously, you're hitting singles at RP 9.5, so that those are able to give you an idea of where you're standing. If you see those slowly start going down, potentially it's time to cap it and either switch or start adding volume.
So that was going to be my next question, kind of coming off of that. So, one con of this is that it potentially has a short-term strategy, but you could look at that in a slightly different way of, I don't know, I guess my first part of this question is, do you have any kind of personal or coaching experience with kind of the resensitization effect of like really stripping down somebody's volume to the bare bones when they hit a plateau or they just kind of feel stuck? And you try to make some changes, but things really don't seem to get moving. It just feels super stale. Ripping things back to the bare bones, and then that's actually going to potentiate further quote unquote normal training. Because that was one of the immediate kind of things I thought of, and kind of, if you have some sort of like periodization model or whatever for powerlifting, doesn't have to be super fancy, but like you do your competition prep, you do your competition. Most times people want to take, a little bit of time off after a meet or, change things up. Maybe you do one of these kind of minimum effective dose approaches to kind of, 2, 4, 6 weeks, something like that, to get this quote unquote resensitization effect. Can less really be more, like all the taglines and bumper sticker quotes? I don't know. But that was kind of something I thought. So that kind of spinning the short-term nature of this on its head a little bit and kind of looking at it in a positive sense. Is that something you've experienced personally coaching, or have any thoughts on the little bit of research that we have?
Yeah, for sure. So there are some athletes that I've worked with where, for some of the reasons that you outlined, plus also psychological reasons, and sometimes more of a slight placebo effect, if I can call it that, where you go from something that is more orthodox to something a bit more unorthodox, but still following basic principles and having the very heavy singles to, okay, it's just for a month plus a couple of weeks. If you present it like that, it's a month plus a couple of weeks. Has helped some of my lifters progress and make some short-term increases in strength. But I think that it would be interesting to see, and I think that's where a few lifters may benefit from this. If you're to use it in a resensitization sort of manner, you could potentially look at having the same RP, the 9 and 9.5, especially if you're coming off a competition and you don't want to be subjected to such heavy weights. And you could add a couple of singles. You could modify these protocols. These protocols were not generated by some sort of god of minimum effective dose, where they were based mostly on coaching experience and what seemed like a logical minimum dose protocol. But you definitely modify them and potentially potentiate their effect even more. But overall, the a big why behind the minimum dose as a lifter myself and as a coach was the peace of mind that this gives me as a lifter and as a coach, to know that, hey, a busy period, or things are hectic at home or whatever, or you can't tolerate as much volume now because your recovery is bad because you're working on some point. We know that for at least a few weeks, you can maintain and make some gains using a minimum dose approach. But again, I would say I advise against presenting this as a sort of like a training method, as I'm afraid some people will do. This is not
You're
a
losing so
training
much money right now.
Okay, I know, and I was going to start selling the official minimum dose kit, which is essentially an empty box.
So
I was for that joke.
So I have a really
Go on,
important
sorry.
question for the god himself of minimum effective dose. I thought it was appropriate just to kind of ask you, kind of, looking at this through a practical lens of how you have applied it in the past and kind of what you've had success with, again, in practice. Because at the end of the day, you design these studies to answer a question, right? You don't. It's not necessarily like you said. It's not like there's some perfect minimum effective dose formula. And when you're designing these studies, you're saying, okay, we're trying to compare things. So there's some considerations there. So my question for you is, from a practical perspective, now that you've done the review of those 6 previously published studies, and then you've done this big project, you did the pilot trial as well. I'm sure you've experimented with athletes and stuff. I'm curious where your head is at as of now, like how the best way to apply it. And again, best is going to be dependent on the individual in a ton of situations, but kind of just a general framework of, okay, this seems to make a lot of sense, this doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, that kind of thing.
One way to apply it, which I found very useful and very sort of calming, is I've had lifters come up against really busy periods in their lives or unstable periods where training was, they weren't able to commit to the 4 or 5 sessions per week for sure, or sometimes even to the 3 sessions. And they weren't able to always commit to the time required to complete some of the volume and the accessory work. So instead of prescribing or having an exact training protocol, the idea of, hey, look, if all fails, try and hit a single at RPE 7 to 9 and a couple of backup sets, and we're good for a few times per week. And at the same time, I believe that also allowed for some of my lifters to kind of feel like, okay, I'm busy, I have other things going on, but at the same time, I will not lose progress, and I might even be able to make some progress. Another way that you can potentially rock it is if you are in a comp prep and you are again limited by time or recovery, and your ability to recover is hindered because of exogenous factors, you could potentially use a minimum dose approach as a sort of a pseudo peak for your comp. But overall, managing fatigue, times where training time is not as great. And overall, as a strategy of psychologically allowing yourself to know that you're making progress, even if you're not able to commit to your usual training volume or training schedule. So I'd say from a practical standpoint, if you're a powerlifter who wants to optimize strength, you're better off doing something that has more training volume, has a sort of a more organized approach to it long term as well. But I also understand that optimal is something that is not constantly, does not have the same definition all the time. So instead of trying to force the volume, the time where you're super busy or unable to recover, and trying to really commit to the original plan, if you feel that can potentially backfire, switch to a more minimum dose approach. That doesn't necessarily need to be the protocols of the study. Tweak it, use singles at RP 6 to 9, use backup sets, but know that most likely you will be able to maintain or make some meaningful progress just by doing a few high effort and potentially high load sets per week.
So
go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, I just wanted to jump in because I have a direct follow up on that. What role do you think intensity of effort plays here? So in this study or in this series of studies, there were the two training groups where the singles were at 9 to 9.5, which is a pretty high intensity of effort. The group that did the heavy singles and the backoffs weren't a super high intensity of effort. But then that third training group in study number 4, I think it was 70% of 1RM. Pat, correct me if I'm wrong here, 70% of 1RM. And I think it was similarly 9 to 9.5. So intensity of effort, I think a lot of people, when training volume is low, I think it generally makes sense as a rule of thumb. Hey, if you're not doing a ton of sets, you're trying to be time efficient, probably makes sense to go pretty close to failure and get a lot of bang for each set. But I'm curious how you kind of conceptualize intensity of effort in this minimum effective dose, kind of thought process or framework.
Yeah. So what we saw from the systematic review was that a few sets close to failure or to failure, that was not for powerlifters but for resistance trained men, because there was no data on women, were enough to allow them to make significant strength increases in 6 to 12 weeks. And we then wanted to sort of mimic high effort in the context of powerlifting, and that's why we utilized an RP of 9 to 9.5, because it's high effort but also in a more specific manner for powerlifters. But I am skeptical, obviously, the fact that we had resource constraints, and it's not that I'm funded by big minimum volume dose industry. We couldn't just say, and we had a limited amount of participants that we could recruit for something as exploratory and experimental as this. I am skeptical as to whether they would be able to still make similar progress even with lower RP singles, potentially maybe increasing the amount of singles to 2 or 3, but having them closer to 6 or to RP 6 or 8. I wouldn't advise against it, but I'm not going to advise fully confidently for it. But it's something that people definitely experiment with. And as a coach, not as a researcher, I would say that I think you'd still make some good progress. But then I would also say that RP8 in the context of powerlifting could be potentially understood as high effort, at least in the context of singles, because it's not the same as a multi-rep set close to failure where you're sweating and you're barely making it there, but it's still 2 reps away from maxing out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I just super quick anecdote here, or just one kind of coaching practical thought, and then Zach, I'll pass it over to you, is that I think maybe a potential thought process for people that want to apply this concept to practice is there might be limitation to thinking of the immediate results you get from a time constrained period. So what I mean by this is perhaps you have, okay, the next 4 months of my life are going to be crazy. But I know I'm not going to be at my peak strength levels in 4 months. I know I'm not going to be hitting massive PRs. I care about how strong I am 5 years from now. Maybe it makes sense. Okay, I'm going to take those singles at RP 6 to 7, save those 5 minutes that take me those next couple jumps to hit a single at 8.5, 9.5, whatever. And I'm going to do a couple sets close to failure, accrue volume very efficiently in the 5 to 12 rep range, because I'm hedging my bets that my best bet for being as strong as possible 5 years from now is having or retaining as much muscle mass in my frame. I'm not saying that's the case, but I'm just saying that's a potential another consideration that, like you said, big minimum effective dose isn't just throwing money at you to do this, 5-year long study to see if that actually plays out. This is just another practical thought I had, in that, this is just a general limitation of research, is that the studies aren't, they're generally short term. So yeah, I just kind of want to throw that in there. If any of you guys strongly disagree, feel free to hop in. If not, I'll pass over to you, Zach.
Zach, you got anything before I ask my next question? No? Okay.
Sorry?
I said, do you have anything on that before I ask my next question? Because I'm going to take us on a tangent, unfortunately.
Are we kind of lagging? There was a bit of but are we on the same page now?
yeah, we're good now.
Okay, perfect. No, I wanted to say, yeah, that's a great point. And I think if there's something major to take away from this, is that, hey, here's a hint. Our research has kind of hinted that, hey, you can make progress with less. Here's what we did. Obviously, this is just what we did for 2 studies. Experiment with what minimum dose can look like for you. Play around with variables, but you can feel sort of confident. So some of the powerlifters, when asked at the last survey, those that hadn't experimented with minimum dose training, I think 88% or something along those lines said that they would be willing to experiment with minimum dose training if there was more evidence around it. So I think the main takeaway, aside from the technicalities and the specific RPEs and the sets and the reps, is here's some research showing that you can make progress with much less than we had originally thought. Don't take this as gospel. Take the concept, modify it to suit your training needs. And as you said, Josh, for you, be maintaining muscle mass and you'd want that extra volume. Take the totality of evidence that we've presented, adjust it to your own training needs, experiment with it, and find your minimum dose approach, rather than trying to replicate exactly what was done in those training studies.
You're a terrible businessman. I just want to make that very clear. But yeah, no, one thing that came to my mind, like as a coach, I'm really excited about this project, because I don't know if you guys have gotten the same things I did, like with a lot of the talk recently about the dose response relationship between volume and hypertrophy. And although the Ralston meta isn't super strong evidence for strength, you could say to a lesser extent strength a little bit. They just like, well, more volume is better. So if I take away volume, I'm just going to lose all my progress. And I think that is like a very natural thought process with like the dose response relationships with those things. So as a coach, I'm really excited that this has come out to say, no, that's not the case. And then also like some of those speculative reasons that I think it could also set us up for longer term success, especially psychologically, like you mentioned, Pac. Like there's only so long like where mentally you can take, higher frequency, higher volume, high load, specific training and mentally before, a lot of times people want to mix things up. So like another application of this, I would imagine, even when you're not constrained for time necessarily, but mentally you want to switch goals a little bit. Like Josh kind of said, is like, if I have a power lifter who's just like, we were just talking off air a little bit, like gets sick of barbells for whatever reason, but they still know they want to come back to powerlifting. Hey, let's do some of this minimum effective dose training on the main lifts, and then just go smash some hack squats, leg extensions, that kind of stuff, just because you enjoy it, and do that for a while too. So I think that's another potential utility of this, both those kind of things.
Yeah, for sure. And it's what you just mentioned about the volume, not just the debate, but in general, I am not a big fan of the creation of camps and the whole Yeah, I'm not going to be obviously the minimum dose concept is an interesting concept, and I've poured 3 years of my life into doing this research, and super happy with what's come out and what we're able to contribute to the lifting community. But obviously, this is not how to train optimally. This is not a concept of optimal training. This is not me saying, "Hey guys, minimum dose." It's more of a, this is the concept. This is it's available to you. Utilize it as you deem appropriate. And the whole idea of either being the super high volume is the way to go all the time, or super low volume, or sets of 5 or sets of 2. I think we need to understand that there's tools, and especially when you're dealing with power lifters of a high level that uh, are not going to be progressing by just adding 5 kilos every week. Um, Being dogmatic with either higher volumes or lower volumes can sometimes backfire. Obviously, I understand that for hypertrophy, you know, uh, being aware of the evidence and saying that, hey, more volume is probably going to be better in certain scenarios. But even there, having that sort of asterisk in terms of condition supply, but that's not something that people want to hear. People want the
Absolutely.
sexy
For sure.
one method.
I guess as a follow-up to that, has your work on this the past few years kind of as a coach scooted down your kind of volume range of like where you kind of start with the client, or kind of like want to live with an athlete?
Yeah, to a certain extent it has, and it has also given me more confidence in sort of experimenting with lower volume sets for the big three, and then having more of that volume distributed to some of the accessories, obviously depending on the training period and phase. But yeah, it has definitely given me that peace of mind that, hey, we do not need to start at X amount of sets. We can start a bit lower and work our way up without slowing down progress by a lot, and even not slowing it down at all, actually.
Yeah, something to kind of follow up there and just agree with is that, like you said, it's a potential avenue for exploration for the given individual. And what's the cost? The cost is, okay, we have some indication that you're probably still going to make progress, or you're going to have a good shot at making progress. Um, so the cost is pretty low, but the potential upside is pretty high, I think, to exploring lower volume, because Zach and I have come across it in Pack. I'm sure you have too in practice, is that some people just don't need a ton to progress, and they progress better with less. Things are more sustainable. Things are more repeatable. So if you kind of experiment, hey, there's this minimum effective dose work. It's a concept. I'm going to kind of explore more of these ranges. We'll see what happens. If progress slows down, okay, we'll go back up if time permits. But maybe it's better. And I think in the hypertrophy world, kind of the knee jerk for troubleshooting is, let's up the dose. Perhaps we have a reason that if progress isn't satisfactory, that it's just as feasible that we should lower the dose of your training. And worst case scenario, progress just slows down. Okay, then we can go back if we detect that. Whereas I think the risks of going higher volume might be a little bit more. There might be
Yeah,
a little bit greater risks.
especially with injuries being a thing, and I see that with a lot of. I don't want to be the with younger lifters, because I'm not that old myself, but I have to be the with the you see it a lot with younger lifters, so I have to be that guy for a sec, where you know, similarly to, to us training when I was 20, 21, I thought, hey, can do squats 7 times a week and small off and whatnot. And all the only limitation to that is, if I'm alive or not. But injury is also a thing. And for most, if not majority, like for the majority of people, powerlifting is a hobby sport. And usually there is, a daily life work schedule, sometimes a manual work, and just constantly pushing training volume can sometimes backfire and set you back for much more time. But to share from the interviews, without obviously revealing the lifter's name, that's a power lifter who is a current all-time record holder, world record holder across all federations. in I think total and deadlift. What they said is that they were surprised by how much lower they could push their training volume from what they had initially thought. And they also said in the interview that they had spoken with some other world record holders. Again, I'm not going to mention names, and they were surprised that they were squatting like once every 2 weeks, etc., etc. Now, obviously, we're talking about extremes, but I really wanted to have those interviews with the coaches and the lead lifters to kind of address the crowd that will go like, yeah, you know, I'm much stronger than the participants of the study, even though the participants were fairly strong, to kind of give credibility to the whole concept. And a lot of those elite lifters, not a lot, some of those elite lifters mentioned how they were able to progress and make good progress, even though their numbers were really, really high, like world record levels. They were able to make progress and hit PRs by doing much less than they had originally thought was necessary. And those quotes are in the supplementary material, because the manuscript ended up being like, it would have been like 40,000 words if we had the whole thematic analysis thrown in the main part.
One thing that just made me think of, this is another kind of anecdote coaching observation question. One thing you'll hear a lot of people say, Josh, you actually shared a study with me the other day that I can't remember the exact design of, but kind of the anecdote that as you get stronger, you actually need less volume. You know, every dose of training volume as you're lifting greater absolute loads seems to be more stressful. Do you think that could be at play here at all? And does that match up with your anecdote?
Are you asking me now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, to a certain extent. I think it will depend on the phase that the lifter is in and what they're coming off. But I've again, completely anecdotally, before I touch on the interview data, yes, a lot of the stronger lifters and some, one of the lifters that I coach, who's a current record holder here in the UK for the deadlift and total at the 120 class at the M1, so 810 kilo total and 340 kilo deadlift. Sorry for the kilos. He was able to progress throughout 2 years with just a few hard sets per week. I had calculated the average amount of sets, but they were like 2 to 5 sets per week for squat and deadlift, and maybe 3 to 6 sets for bench, or maybe four to 7. And he was a heavy dude, very muscular dude, a very strong dude, and he was able to continue making progress with very specific, specific and sort of boring plain, you know, adding a bit of weight and doing sets of 3, and that's that. And that's what came out of some of the interviews, that as a lifter gets stronger. Actually, some coaches said what you just mentioned. Some coaches said the exact opposite.
Yeah.
So there was a bit of a,
Yep.
the stronger the lifter, the less the volume, and others said the stronger the
They
lifter,
need more.
Yeah, and I saw a bit of dichotomy in terms of responses there, and which I found interesting, because I think minimum dose training is something that like some people are afraid to experiment with. Like if you're doing your hobby sport, especially at a competitive level, and you know that if I do a bit more, I might get a bit more out of it, there's very little chance that you're going to suddenly start using yourself as a guinea pig and being like, let me just try a few singles at RPE 8 this week, or I'll do 2 triples instead of 5. And I'm curious to see how many of those people, like how much of that volume that people are doing is actually not necessary and could be just extra fatigue that they don't need.
Mm. Yeah,
Obviously, opening Pandora's box a bit there with those, those open statements.
I was going to say that one thing that made me think of is like, do we think that some of these anecdotes are like kind of the self-selection of the sport, like the people that are the most successful, who are going to value the anecdote more so from, are people that respond to training and need less training volume over time, so that it starts to become like a positive anecdote of people that, you know, make it to the higher levels because lower training volumes take less time. Like you said, powerlifting is generally a hobby sport for most people, even at some of the upper levels. They have other things in their life that kind of set these constraints of what is feasible in terms of the amount of volume you can perform. And so that's kind of going to set a cap for like people that need additional volume to progress theoretically. These people that are, low volume responders are probably going to kind of rise to the top of the sport. I wonder if that's at play here a little bit too. Now I'm just spitballing, but.
And I think it's what you mentioned about muscle mass and their starting point, I think may also affect that. So you do have more advanced or experienced lifters that may not be as muscular as others, that may impact how much volume they need to still make progress in training. And also I think it's as a very minor point, the placebo effect has to be taken into consideration and how much lifters buy into a program. So if you have a lifter and you hit him with, hey, we're going to be trying this minimum dose, minimum, less, what's the less we're going to be trying, using those words, it may kind of put them in a mindset of, oh, we're trying things. This is probably not going to work. I'm used to doing 10 times that. Whereas if they buy into it and they're like, yeah, heavy singles, let's go, as some people did, and I think that can have an effect as well. So if you're used to volume, Shaco, 25 triples at 70%. For squat, and then squat later in the session as well, another 25 triples, and then all of a sudden your coach or you read that 1 set of 1 and 3 triples twice a week, you may be like, there's no chance. This goes completely against what I've been doing all this time, and there's no way this will work.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing to echo is just that, like, I think keeping in mind the placebo effect and buy-in is so important, and just that there's always going to be anecdotes both ways. And Zach kind of touched on selection bias. Like one of our primary research interests is proximity to failure, and a lot of people like to say, like all the biggest bodybuilders, they all train to failure. Like, how can you disregard that? It's like, yes, that does seem to be the case for certain individuals. But we've also seen a lot of people, when you take them, when they were doing all their sets, RP9, RP10, you pull them back a little bit. Okay, we can add 10, 20% volume, or we just keep the volume the same, decrease proximity to failure. That seems to work really, really well for them. So they can actually be ready to squat, within the next 7 days. So, there's another example of where the anecdotes go both ways. Volume, I think there's anecdotes both ways. How volume should change over time as you advance in your career. There's anecdotes both ways. I just always like to keep that in mind, that like anecdote is kind of like just a nebulous thing, because there's part of it is going to be selection bias, buy-in, placebo effect. And yeah, there's just,
things can be much more flexible than people think.
There's a lot of ways to get strong.
Oh, sorry. I think I lagged and then I cut you off.
Oh, no. I was just adding on to what you were saying, that there's a lot of ways to get strong.
So you were cutting me off.
Yeah, I cut you off. The god
the
of
minimum
MED,
effective dose god.
That's a caffeine-free Diet Coke, right?
No, it's LaCroix. I'm a little girl.
I don't know what LaCroix is because I'm from the
it's like sparkling water.
I was going to say that it's I made the joke now and lost my train of thought, but people have this and once you start looking behind the curtain, you start looking at the research and realizing that, hey, powerlifting wise, there's those 3 studies and that 1 study, there's not much, at least training study wise, and we base a lot of stuff on low sample training studies with recreationally active individuals, and the protocols often not, they do not resemble what a powerlifter would do. Obviously, it's not evidence that it is to be disregarded, but it needs to be interpreted with caution. But people have some of these have the notion that we have it all figured out already to a T, like the same with periodization. How people regard periodization as this holy concept that has been like researched to the absolute limit, especially in the context of powerlifting. and they where in reality we are still figuring a lot of the stuff out. I think as long as you address some basic principles and not do something completely unorthodox, there's many ways to progress, and there's many ways to adjust the training protocol and make meaningful progress. That's just more as a side comment. And I think it's kind of backed up by what you said, the two different sides to anecdotes. So we see people progressing with a completely opposite approaches to training. The low volume, heavy, whatever approach versus Shaco sub-maximal sets on sets on sets. Both are producing world champions. So I think that's kind of a clue that, hey, maybe things are not as absolute as some people present them to be for whatever agenda they may have.
That literally flows directly into my next question. This is kind of a theoretical one. All of us like to talk about the particulars of training, try to talk about optimal procedures, all that kind of stuff. Do you think that training, quote unquote, optimally, and whatever that is at that time in your life and all that, do you think that's actually going to get you to a higher lifetime peak of whatever your kind of goal is? Or do you think that is simply going to get you there faster, so long as you take a suboptimal approach, but continue to stay consistent with training?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that being I think that it can sometimes be difficult to define what optimal is. So it may be optimal on paper, but it may not really fit your lifestyle. But at the same time, it's very difficult to actually figure out optimal. So I will just say I'm not entirely sure. I don't feel I feel confident in saying that I believe that you can adopt a suboptimal, quote unquote, suboptimal approach and still reach that peak, but maybe later. But at the same time, if the optimal approach on paper is not really suitable to your lifestyle, or there's other factors that can contribute to injury and overall things not going well, then that may backfire as well. So I gave you a very long answer, which didn't mean much, but hey, here we are.
That's what we got.
Yeah, man. Once again, giving us like an answer like a true scientist, which is awesome. And of course, there is no way to know, right? Because I think with some of the studies that have popped up over the last couple of years, in which the researchers will look at previous training volumes and try to prescribe protocols based on their previous training volumes, I think there's starting to be some indication that what you were doing before is going to influence how you respond to subsequent training, right? So with this minimum effective dose framework or concept, I should say, was like, okay, results might not be optimal for these next 8 to 10 weeks, but maybe it'll kind of resensitize me. Maybe that'll get me to a higher peak for psychological or physiological reasons. Maybe that'll get me to the same peak. Maybe that'll get me to a lower peak. It's really hard to say. My hunch is that it'll probably get you to a similar spot as long as you're not doing this suboptimal training for 7 years.
Exactly.
That's my hunch. I think that kind of makes sense. But I mean, like we were talking about before, training studies are going to be constrained by length. And we have to do our best to kind of piece the puzzle pieces together and come up with our and come up with our best guess for practice. So I think the last question we have for you, and unless you want to jump in here, Zach, is what do you think is the next step in this area of research? So, you guys have done awesome work. Again, kind of, hey, here's this concept. This seems to applying some of this stuff, you can probably get some meaningful changes with really low dose of training. Okay, now what's next? What do you think is going to be the most potent way to kind of progress this research going forward?
I don't have a definite answer that is completely well thought, so this may change in the future. But I would really like to actually look, now that there will be a bit more confidence and a bit more hype around the concept to actually do those longer term studies and play around with potentially lower RPEs and see whether different protocols can work, but also have a look at the minimum dose, and potentially that would need to be a collaborative effort in the world of other sports, where athletes that need to train a multitude of athletic qualities might benefit much more than a powerlifter who only needs to train for maximal strength from the minimum dose. So I'd be interested to see in that world how and whether minimum dose training needs adapting. But that said, I do want, as a sort of not an official postdoc, but now that the PhD is nearly finished, to kind of look at dose and strength and hypertrophy, and try and do like a bigger study, potentially dedicating a year or so on that, and kind of recruiting a lot of the people that we have available here in the UK that we know and are also lifters, and kind of try to provide a bit more evidence around the whole idea of around the relationship of volume and hypertrophy and strength, but have a more complete project done around that. So I give you a few responses there, but I would definitely like to do some more minimum dose stuff, lower RPEs, try a few different protocol configurations out, and yeah, see how and whether athletes of other sports can successfully utilize that.
One thing that I mean, I don't want to take us too long here. I think we're kind of coming to the end here, but I know Dr. Steele is obviously, we kind of had a few moments where we kind of mentioned it, like he's a really big advocate of making sure that we're properly defining intensity of effort, what momentary failure means, all that kind of stuff. And a lot of the volume research that's just like such a big confounder, right? Of like, is it, I'm not saying anything negatively about the work, but like, is it possible to do some of the protocols that are in the research to failure, quote unquote? Like I think that really could shape the conversation, just because I know that your guys' group would be very, very particular about how you're defining that and executing that. I think that'd be a really interesting area to explore. Does this dose response relationship actually go up past 20 sets when we're taking things to defining effort properly and contextualizing that conversation to, that's something me and Josh talk about all the time is, almost every single training variable that we discuss in terms of these big principles is kind of benchmarked by effort and how that kind of influences everything. What load do we need to train at? Well, are the sets to failure? Are they not to failure? Are they far from failure? Are they close to failure? Like there's all this stuff that I think influence and kind of permeates into all the little different variables that we talk about. So I'm just excited to hear that you're interested in kind of exploring that area to kind of take the minimum effective dose and maybe make it a little bit more of a spectrum, and just see kind of how that variable, I would imagine, would be pretty tightly controlled and would influence things.
I mean, real science, like, okay, we talk about all this fake science now, but as the legend Tom Platz once said, you always have 5 more. 5, 5, 5, 5. Just do 5 more, and that's that. But joking aside, it will be really nice, as I sometimes express it, to get the freaks in the lab, get train people from the gyms. We do have a pool of a lot of people that we know from the powerlifting and bodybuilding gyms that we go to, and obviously we coach people around the area, and we are at the university. So there's also students that are lifters that are aware of the group. Get them to participate in a study. Also try, and I'm not sure if I'm supposed to reveal this, but hey ho, it would be interesting to also see what changes in hypertrophy are noticeable. Because as this is Dr. James Steele, so this is me just mentioning his idea. So this was not my idea. As lifters and as people that enjoy lifting for strength and overall hypertrophy beyond health benefits, the fact that a study says, hey, this guy's bicep or chest grew by X amount and it was a statistically significant difference, it would be nice within a study where we're looking at the dose response between strength and hypertrophy, training volume and strength and hypertrophy, to also see, by kind of involving potentially bodybuilding judges or bodybuilders and kind of blinding them and having them before and after images, et cetera, to see whether at which point do those changes mean something to the eye. Because we want to, when we're training for hypertrophy, we do not, we care for the muscle to be, at least some people care for the muscle to be visually bigger and noticeably bigger, not in some of those training studies.
Show them your ultrasound scans.
Yeah. That would be nice though, if you pulled up ultrasound. Okay, there you go. What? But yeah, so yeah, that would be interesting to see, to kind of help the whole debate, because I think it has gone a bit, there's obviously limitations, and the thing that many people do not understand is once you get into the nitty gritty of research and you are actually there doing the research, as weird as it sounds, things are not as simple and as straightforward, especially when you're recruiting trained populations and powerlifters, and you need people to commit to a certain training protocol. So it's not as easy as, hey, let's do the big volume study 1 year. Hey, person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 55, person 58. Okay, these are the protocols. Come to the lab then, and especially when there's no funding. Yep. Anyways, going off on a tangent. That's me. I don't know what this is. Cultural appropriation. I'm Greek. I can do it.
Yeah, man. I think all this stuff is super exciting. One last spitball here is, I think we kind of mentioned earlier in the podcast how it kind of makes intuitive sense. Hey, if we're going to be very time efficient in the gym, a lower or a higher intensity of effort that's probably a good rule of thumb. But you kind of mentioned potentially looking at like lower RPE type work, and my mind was just kind of going like, how could we configure a very time efficient protocol to kind of maximize the volume accumulated in a given period of time? Like, maybe there's a middle ground in which you're still training heavy enough, you're still training hard enough, of course, but if you're taking a set with 70% to RP 9 to 9.5, you're going to need some time to be ready to go again. So, of course, you guys designed that to look at a concept, but maybe in practice, hey, if maybe we can get to like more relative volume or like more reps at a given load if we do more sets but shorter rest periods. So like, point being is there may be a give and a take with if you are doing a multi-set protocol to a slightly lower intensity of effort. And again, like, I think there's some indication based on studies 3 and 4 here that more volume, just with the addition of those backoffs is beneficial. So anyway, I'm just kind of rambling here that I think there might be something there in terms of, hey, how can we configure lower RP training, but it's still super time efficient because you have that advantage of you don't have to rest as long between sets.
Two coaches that were interviewed, one, in my opinion, one of the best in the world, with an extreme resume of IPF world champions and thousands of people, or at least hundreds of people coached, who also has one of the most known franchises in the coaching world, and a coach that was part of that franchise. They did mention of experimenting with singles at RP 5 to 6 with just one or two lifters, if I'm not mistaken, and they did see really, really nice progress. And I was and talking to a few other lifters lately, the idea, like, I think it's definitely worth experimenting with it and seeing whether, even if it's one study for 6 to 12 weeks of one group doing, try and get as many people as possible and have one group doing RP 6 to maximum or 5 to maximum 8 work, and see how far they can go. Because even if they increase, even if they have like a 30 to 50% probability of of achieving meaningful increases, or even if they maintain slightly increase, I think that's definitely something useful for us as coaches and lifters. If you can make some progress, or at least maintain with low volumes and relatively low effort, hey, that's amazing. but we shall see.
Right on, man. Excited to kind of follow along and see what comes up next. Zach, you got anything else, or are we good to wrap up?
No, man. Pack, appreciate you coming on, dude. It was a great chat.
And you guys.
Definitely got my mind going quite a bit, so I'll probably have to pester you with some more questions here soon.
For sure, and thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, seriously. All kidding aside, the way you answered the questions and kind of being true to the results of your study, not overstating things. We have a ton of respect for that. Even though you hit us with a little side chest today, and you are, and,
come on,
and
bro.
You are a good poster boy for minimum effective dose, but you're not gonna create a camp around it. I totally respect that, man, and ton of respect for the work you guys have been doing. So, and again, thank you so much for coming on today. Where can people reach out to you, get in contact with you?
Buy the minimum effective dose starter pack. Like, where's all that going down?
So, no joking aside, if you want to easily access the paper, you can go to minimumdosetraining.com. That will redirect you to the paper. I thought getting a domain for it makes it a bit easier, especially because it's not PubMed indexed yet, as it's a preprint. So it hasn't been officially peer-reviewed, et cetera, et cetera. It's under peer review now. So minimumdosetraining.com to read the paper that we were referring to. You can find me on Instagram, where I keep more of a mixed profile. I post research stuff and lifting stuff, but it's also a personal profile at Polkarots, POLKAROTS. But I have my more serious academic Twitter, which I use as well, which is at PAK, PAK, and then Patroklos, PATROKLOS. And on ResearchGate, if you find any of the work, there's obviously my profile there with all the other research. So yeah, that's that, I think. Yeah. Awesome. And my mobile phone number. No.
All right, man. Thank you so much for coming on. We'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Thanks for tuning in to the Data Driven Strength podcast. If you have a quick second to leave us a rating and review, that'd be much appreciated, but definitely do that after you go follow PAK on all the things he just mentioned and go check out their paper. Read the 80-page paper, and then you can leave a rating and review on the Data Driven Strength podcast. Take care, everyone.